The year was 1431, when Rodrigo Borgia was born in the small town of Zativa, near Valencia, Spain. His uncle, Alfonso de Borgia, would later become Pope Calixtus III, opening doors that would shape young Rodrigo's destiny. From his earliest years, Rodrigo displayed an exceptional intelligence and an insatiable hunger for power that would define his entire existence. At the age of 25, Rodrigo was already a cardinal, appointed by his uncle in a clear act of nepotism that scandalized many within the church. But Rodrigo possessed more than just family connections. He was charismatic, cunning, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people and situations. These talents, combined with his growing wealth and influence, made him one of the most powerful men in Rome long before he ever dreamed of wearing the papal tiara. It was during his early years as a cardinal that Rodrigo began his relationship with Vanessa de Catane, a Roman noblewoman of striking beauty and sharp intellect. Their affair was conducted with discretion, but it was no secret among the Roman elite. Vanessa would bear him 4 children: Cesare I, Lucrezia, and Jofre. Unlike many clerics who abandoned their illegitimate offspring, Rodrigo openly acknowledged and adored his children, lavishing them with attention, education, and opportunities that would have been unthinkable for bastards of lesser men. Cesare, born in 1475, was clearly his father's favorite. Even as a child, he displayed a fierce intelligence and an almost frightening intensity. Rodrigo saw in his eldest son the perfect instrument for his ambitions. Juan, born 2 years later, was handsome and charming but lacked his brother's steel. Lucrezia, born in 1480, became the apple of her father's eye, a beautiful and intelligent girl who would become one of the most powerful women of her age. Young Jofre, the youngest, was often overshadowed by his more dynamic siblings but remained deeply loved by his father. For decades, Rodrigo accumulated power, wealth, and influence within the church hierarchy. He served multiple popes, always positioning himself as indispensable, always building his network of allies and debtors. His palace in Rome became a center of political intrigue, where cardinals, ambassadors, and nobles gathered to seek his favor. He was known for his lavish entertainments, his sharp wit, and his ability to broker deals that seemed impossible to others. The death of Pope Innocent VIII in 1492 presented Rodrigo with the opportunity he had been preparing for his entire adult life. The conclave that followed was one of the most corrupt in church history. Rodrigo, now 61 years old, deployed every weapon in his considerable arsenal. He made promises of lucrative positions, offered vast sums of money, and leveraged decades of accumulated favors and debts. Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, brother of the Duke of Milan, became his key ally after receiving promises of the vice-chancellorship and other valuable benefices. The voting stretched for days, with the cardinals locked in the Sistine Chapel under the scorching August heat. Rodrigo's main rival was Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, a fierce and uncompromising man who would later become Pope Julius II. But della Rovere lacked Rodrigo's political finesse and, crucially, his vast financial resources. One by one, Rodrigo secured the votes he needed through a combination of bribery, promises, and political maneuvering that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. When the white smoke finally rose from the Sistine Chapel chimney, the crowd gathered in St. Peter's Square learned that Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia had been elected pope, taking the name Alexander VI. The news sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Many had expected the election of a reform-minded pope who would address the growing corruption within the church. Instead, they had chosen a man whose own life embodied many of the problems that plagued the institution. Alexander's first acts, as pope, revealed his true priorities. He immediately began promoting his children to positions of power and influence. Cesare, barely 18, was made Archbishop of Valencia and later a cardinal. Juan was showered with titles and lands, including the Duchy of Lucrezia, though still a child, was already being considered for strategic marriages that would advance Borgia interests. The new pope's court quickly became notorious for its extravagance and moral laxity. Alexander made no attempt to hide his relationship with Vanessa or his devotion to his children. He hosted elaborate banquets, theatrical performances, and celebrations that scandalized the more pious members of the church hierarchy. Critics whispered that the Vatican had become more like a Renaissance prince's court than the spiritual center of Christendom. But Alexander was far more than just a hedonistic pope. He was a shrewd political operator who understood that the papacy, survival in the turbulent world of Renaissance Italy, required temporal power to match its spiritual authority. The Italian peninsula was a patchwork of competing city-states, duchies, and kingdoms, all constantly at war with each other, and increasingly threatened by the growing power of France and Spain. Alexander's strategy was to use his papal authority and his family's talents to carve out a powerful state in central Italy that could serve as a buffer against foreign invasion and a source of wealth and power for the Borgia dynasty. This vision required military strength, diplomatic cunning, and a willingness to employ methods that would have horrified earlier generations of church leaders. The transformation of Cesare from cardinal to military commander became central to this strategy. Unlike his father, who had risen through the church hierarchy, Cesare chafed under the restrictions of clerical life. He was a man of action, possessed of a brilliant strategic mind and a ruthless determination that made him both feared and respected throughout Italy. Alexander recognized that his eldest son's talents were wasted in ecclesiastical robes and began planning his transition to secular power. The death of Juan, Duke of Gandia, in 1497, marked a turning point in Borgia history. Juan's body was found, floating in the Tiber River, bearing multiple stab wounds. The murder remains one of history's great unsolved mysteries, with suspicion falling on various enemies of the Borgia family. Some even whispered that Cesare himself had eliminated his brother to clear his own path to power, though no evidence was ever found to support this accusation. Alexander was devastated by Juan's death. For a brief period, he spoke of reforming the church and leading a more pious life, but grief soon gave way to renewed determination to secure his family's future. Juan's death had eliminated the intended military leader of the Borgia clan, but it also freed Cesare from the constraints of his cardinal's hat. In an unprecedented move, Cesare resigned his cardinalate and embraced the secular life his temperament had always demanded. With papal approval, Cesare married Charlotte d'Albret, sister-in-law of the King of France, cementing a crucial alliance with French power. King Louis XII granted him the title Duke of Valentinois, providing him with both legitimacy and resources for his military campaigns. Cesare had transformed himself from Cardinal Borgia into Duke Valentino, one of the most feared military commanders in Italy. The campaigns that followed demonstrated both the brilliance and the brutality that characterized Borgia rule. Cesare moved through the Romagna, the papal territory north of Rome, with lightning speed and devastating effectiveness. City after city fell to his forces, their rulers either fleeing, submitting, or meeting violent ends. His methods were ruthless, but efficient, combining military prowess with psychological warfare and political manipulation. Cesare's military campaigns in the Romagna were marked by a calculated brutality that sent shockwaves throughout Italy. His conquest of Emilia and Forak in 1499 demonstrated his tactical genius and his willingness to employ terror as a weapon. Caterina Sforza, the formidable Lady of Forak, had expected to hold her fortress against any assault. She was renowned as one of the most capable military leaders of her time, a woman who had successfully defended her territories against multiple enemies. But Cesare's approach was unlike anything she had faced before. He surrounded her fortress with overwhelming force, cutting off all supply lines and escape routes. Then, rather than attempt a costly siege, he systematically destroyed the surrounding countryside, burning crops, slaughtering livestock, and driving the peasants from their homes. The message was clear: resistance to Borgia rule would bring not just military defeat, but complete devastation. When Caterina finally surrendered, Cesare treated her with a mixture of respect and ruthless pragmatism. She was taken to Rome as a prisoner, but her territories were incorporated into the growing Borgia domain. Back in Rome, Alexander watched his son's victories with immense pride and satisfaction. Each conquered city brought new revenues to the papal treasury and expanded the territorial base of Borgia power. The Pope used these successes to justify his policies to critics within the church hierarchy. He argued that a strong papacy required strong temporal power, and that the chaos and warfare that had plagued the papal states for generations could only be ended through decisive military action. But Alexander's methods of financing these campaigns scandalized even his supporters. The sale of church offices reached unprecedented levels during his reign. Cardinals' hats were openly auctioned to the highest bidders, with wealthy families throughout Europe competing to purchase high ecclesiastical positions for their sons. The Pope created new offices specifically to sell them, generating vast sums that were immediately channeled to Caesare's military machine. The practice of selling indulgences also expanded dramatically under Alexander's rule. Wealthy sinners could purchase forgiveness for almost any transgression. with the proceeds flowing directly into the papal treasury. Critics throughout Europe began to speak openly of the corruption that had infected the highest levels of the church. In Germany, a young monk named Martin Luther was beginning to formulate the criticisms that would eventually lead to the Protestant Reformation. Lucrezia, meanwhile, had become one of the most important political assets in her father's arsenal. Her second marriage, to Alfonso of Aragon, had been arranged to strengthen ties with the Kingdom of Naples. Alfonso was a handsome and cultured prince, and for a brief time, Lucrezia seemed to have found genuine happiness. She bore him a son, Rodrigo, named after his grandfather, and appeared to be settling into the role of a conventional, Renaissance noblewoman. But Alexander's shifting political alliances soon made Alfonso a liability rather than an asset. When the Pope decided to ally with France against Naples, Alfonso's continued existence became an inconvenience. In 1500, Alfonso was attacked by unknown assailants while walking near the Vatican. He survived the initial assault but was recovering in papal apartments when he was found dead, apparently strangled in his bed. No one was ever officially charged with the murder, but few doubted that Cesare had ordered the killing to clear the way for a more advantageous marriage for his sister. Lucrezia's reaction to her husband's death revealed the steel beneath her beautiful exterior. She grieved genuinely for Alfonso, but she also understood the political realities that governed her life. She was a Borgia, and her personal happiness would always be subordinate to family interests. When Alexander arranged her third marriage to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duke of Ferrara, she accepted with the grace and dignity that had made her one of the most admired women in Italy. The d'Este alliance represented a significant diplomatic triumph for the Borgias. Ferrara was one of the most cultured and powerful courts in northern Italy, and the marriage gave the family crucial allies in their ongoing struggles with Venice and other northern powers. Lucrezia's intelligence and charm quickly won over her new family, and she began to play an increasingly important role in the complex diplomatic negotiations that characterized Renaissance politics. Cesare's conquests continued with relentless efficiency. The cities of Pesaro, Rimini, and Firenze fell in rapid succession, their rulers either fleeing or meeting violent ends. His treatment of conquered territories followed a consistent pattern: initial brutality to crush resistance, followed by efficient administration designed to maximize revenues and maintain order. He appointed capable governors, reformed legal systems, and invested in infrastructure projects that improved trade and communication. But Cesare's methods also created a growing number of enemies throughout Italy. The displaced rulers of conquered territories plotted constantly for revenge, while established powers like Venice and Florence watched nervously as Borgia influence expanded. In 1502, several of Cesare's own commanders, led by Vitello and Oliverato da Fermo, formed a conspiracy against him. They had grown wealthy and powerful serving the Borgia cause, but they feared that Cesare's ultimate goal was to eliminate all potential rivals to his authority. The conspiracy presented Cesare with his greatest challenge yet. His enemies had significant military forces and intimate knowledge of his methods and weaknesses. They controlled strategic territories and had formed alliances with other enemies of Borgia power. For a brief moment, it seemed that Cesare's rapid rise might be followed by an equally rapid fall. But Cesare's response to the conspiracy demonstrated why he was considered one of the most brilliant military and political minds of his generation. Rather than meet his enemies in open battle, where the outcome would be uncertain, he chose to employ deception and psychological warfare. He opened negotiations with the conspirators, appearing to offer concessions and compromises that might satisfy their demands. The negotiations culminated in a meeting at Senegal. On December 31, 1502, Cesare had convinced his enemies that he was prepared to make peace and restore them to their former positions. The conspirators arrived with minimal guards, expecting to participate in a ceremonial reconciliation. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a carefully planned ambush. Vitellozzo Vitelli and Oliverato da Fermo were arrested immediately and executed that same night. Other conspirators were hunted down and eliminated over the following weeks. Senegalia massacre, as it came to be known, sent a clear message throughout Italy about the price of opposing Borgia power. Cesare had demonstrated that he was not merely a skilled military commander, but a master of political intrigue who could outmaneuver even the most experienced conspirators. His reputation for ruthless efficiency was now matched by a reputation for brilliant strategic thinking that made him one of the most feared men in Europe. Alexander watched these developments with immense satisfaction. His vision of a powerful Borgia state was becoming reality. with Cesare serving as the military arm and Lucrezia providing crucial diplomatic connections. The Pope himself continued to manage the complex web of alliances and enmities that characterized Italian politics, using his spiritual authority to legitimize actions that would have been considered criminal if undertaken by secular rulers. But the very success of the Borgia project was creating new challenges and enemies. The rapid expansion of papal territory had alarmed other Italian powers, while the methods employed had scandalized much of Christian Europe. Cardinals within the church hierarchy were beginning to organize opposition to Alexander's policies, while foreign powers were calculating whether Borgia ambitions threatened their own interests in Italy. The growing opposition to Borgia power manifested itself in various forms throughout Italy and Europe. Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, Alexander's longtime rival, had fled to France, where he worked tirelessly to build a coalition against the Pope. He found receptive audiences among French nobles who were growing concerned about Caesar's rapid territorial expansion and his close ties to King Louis XII. Della Rovere argued that Alexander had corrupted the papacy beyond recognition, and that only his removal could restore the Church's moral authority. In Venice, the ruling council watched Caesar's conquests with increasing alarm. The Borgias now controlled territories that bordered Venetian possessions, and their efficient administration was beginning to attract trade that had previously flowed through Venetian ports. The Venetians began secretly funding resistance movements in Borgia territories while publicly maintaining diplomatic relations with Rome. They understood that open warfare with the Pope would be diplomatically disastrous, but they were determined to prevent further Borgia expansion. Florence presented a different kind of challenge. The Florentine Republic, led by men like Niccolò Machiavelli, recognized Caesar's military genius and political acumen. They had witnessed his campaigns firsthand and understood that direct opposition would be futile. Instead, they chose a policy of careful neutrality, offering tribute and cooperation, while secretly preparing their defenses and seeking allies who might eventually contain Borgia ambitions. Machiavelli himself had spent considerable time observing Cesare during diplomatic missions, and he was both fascinated and horrified by what he saw. The future author of The Prince recognized in Cesare Borgia the perfect embodiment of the ruthless pragmatism that he believed was necessary for effective rule in the chaotic world of Renaissance politics. Yet even Machiavelli was troubled by the complete absence of moral constraints that characterized Borgia methods. The financial cost of maintaining Caesar's military machine was becoming increasingly burdensome for the papal treasury. Each campaign required enormous expenditures for soldiers, weapons, and supplies, while the conquered territories, though valuable, took time to generate significant revenues. Alexander was forced to employ increasingly creative and controversial methods to raise funds, including the confiscation of property from wealthy Romans on trumped-up charges and the sale of church treasures that had been accumulated over centuries. The Pope's personal life during this period reflected the same mixture of political calculation and genuine affection that had always characterized his relationships. His affair with Vanessa de Catane had ended years earlier, replaced by a new relationship with the young and beautiful Giulia Farnese. Giulia, barely 20 when their relationship began, was married to Orsino Orsini, but this presented no obstacle to the Pope's desires. Her brother, Alessandro Farnese, was rewarded for his sister's services with a cardinal's hat, beginning a career that would eventually lead him to the papacy as Paul III. The relationship with Giulia Farnese scandalized even Romans who had grown accustomed to papal improprieties. She was openly referred to as the Pope's mistress and wielded considerable influence over church appointments and policies. Critics dubbed her the Bride of Christ in mocking reference to her relationship with the Vicar of Christ on earth. But Alexander seemed oblivious to such criticism, lavishing gifts and attention on Giulia while continuing to pursue his dynastic ambitions with undiminished energy. Caesar's military campaigns during 1503 reached their peak with his assault on the remaining independent territories in the Rumonia and his plans for expansion into Tuscany. His army had grown into one of the most professional and effective military forces in Italy, combining French heavy cavalry, Swiss infantry, and Italian artillery in a way that maximized their respective strengths. His commanders were chosen for competence rather than birth, and his soldiers were paid regularly and equipped with the finest weapons available. But Caesar's very success was creating the conditions for his eventual downfall. His rapid conquests had outpaced his ability to consolidate control, leaving him dependent on the continued support of his father's papal authority. Many of his new subjects remained loyal to their former rulers, while his harsh methods had created a reservoir of resentment that could be exploited by his enemies. Most critically, his entire position depended on Alexander's continued health and political support. The summer of 1503 brought an unusually severe outbreak of malaria to Rome. The disease, carried by mosquitoes breeding in the marshy areas around the city, struck down rich and poor alike. Alexander, now 73 years old, had survived many previous outbreaks, but his advanced age made him increasingly vulnerable. Cesare, despite his youth and strength, also fell ill, though his case proved less severe than his father's. On August 6, 1503, Alexander VI attended a dinner party at the villa of Cardinal Adriano Cas. The evening was typical of the lavish entertainments that characterized papal court life, with elaborate courses, fine wines, and animated conversation about politics and culture. Alexander appeared to be in good health and spirits, discussing plans for future military campaigns and diplomatic initiatives. But within days of the dinner, both Alexander and Cesare fell seriously ill with symptoms that included high fever, vomiting, and severe weakness. Rumors immediately began circulating that the Pope and his son had been poisoned, possibly by their enemies or even by each other in a plot gone wrong. The timing seemed too convenient for those who opposed Borgia power, and the simultaneous illness of both men suggested deliberate action rather than natural disease. Some whispered that Alexander had prepared poisoned wine for Cardinal Castellesi, but had accidentally consumed it himself, while others suggested that Cesare had attempted to eliminate his father to claim sole power. But the most likely explanation was that both men had contracted malaria from the mosquitoes that swarmed around Rome during the hot summer months. The disease was endemic in the region and had killed numerous popes and cardinals over the centuries. Alexander's advanced age made him particularly vulnerable, while Caesare's illness, though severe, was not life-threatening for a man in his prime. As Alexander's condition deteriorated, the political implications became clear to everyone in Rome. The Pope's death would trigger a new papal election, and there was no guarantee that the next Pope would support Caesare's territorial ambitions. Indeed, many of the cardinals who would participate in the conclave were known enemies of Borgia power, who had been waiting years for an opportunity to reverse Alexander's policies. Cesare, despite his own illness, began making desperate preparations to maintain his position after his father's death. He moved troops closer to Rome, secured the papal treasury, and attempted to negotiate agreements with potential papal candidates. But his weakened condition and the speed of Alexander's decline left him with limited options and little time to implement comprehensive plans. On August 18, 1503, Pope Alexander VI died in his papal apartments, surrounded by a small group of loyal servants and family members. His death marked the end of one of the most controversial and consequential papacies in church history. For 11 years, he had wielded the spiritual authority of the papacy in pursuit of temporal power and dynastic ambition, transforming the church into an instrument of Borgia family interests while scandalizing Christian Europe with his personal conduct and political methods. The immediate aftermath of Alexander's death revealed the fragility of the empire he and Cesare had built. Without papal authority to legitimize their actions, Caesare's conquests became vulnerable to reconquest by their former rulers and their allies. The cardinals who had been suppressed or marginalized during Alexander's reign began organizing to elect a pope who would reverse Borgia policies and restore what they considered proper church governance. The conclave that followed Alexander's death was unlike any in recent memory. The cardinals who gathered in the Sistine Chapel carried with them 11 years of accumulated resentment against Borgia rule. Many had been marginalized, threatened, or impoverished by Alexander's policies, and they were determined to elect a pope who would restore traditional church governance and eliminate Borgia influence from the Vatican. Cesare, still recovering from his illness, found himself in an impossible position. His military forces controlled much of central Italy, but without papal support, his legitimacy was questionable. The revenues that had funded his campaigns came primarily from church sources that would be cut off under a hostile pope. Most critically, many of his conquered territories were already showing signs of rebellion as news of Alexander's death spread throughout Italy. The election of Francesco Piccolomini as Pope Pius III seemed to offer Cesare a brief reprieve. Pic was elderly and in poor health, and he had maintained relatively cordial relations with the Borgias during Alexander's reign. But Pius III's papacy lasted only 26 days before he too succumbed to illness. triggering yet another conclave and prolonging the uncertainty that was undermining Caesar's position. The second conclave produced the result that Cesare had most feared: the election of his father's longtime enemy, Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, as Pope Julius II. Della Rovere had spent years in exile, plotting against Borgia power, and his first acts as Pope made clear his intention to destroy everything that Alexander had built. He immediately began reversing Alexander's appointments, redistributing Borgia territories, and building coalitions against Caesar's remaining strongholds. Julius II was everything that Alexander had not been: austere in his personal life, genuinely committed to church reform, and determined to restore papal authority through spiritual rather than dynastic means. But he was also a formidable political operator who understood that eliminating Borgia influence would require careful planning and substantial military force. He began systematically undermining Caesar's position while building his own power base among Italian rulers who had suffered under Borgia expansion. Caesar's response to these challenges demonstrated both his strategic brilliance and the fundamental weakness of his position. He attempted to maintain his territories through a combination of military action and diplomatic negotiation. But he was fighting a losing battle against overwhelming odds. His former allies began abandoning him as it became clear that Borgia power was waning, while his enemies grew bolder in their attacks on his remaining strongholds. The siege of Cesena in late 1503 marked the beginning of the end for Caesar's territorial empire. The city had been one of his most important strongholds, strategically located and heavily fortified. But the garrison, unpaid for months and facing a superior enemy force, surrendered after only token resistance. The fall of Cesena triggered a cascade of defections and surrenders throughout Caesar's territories, as local commanders calculated that continued resistance was futile. Lucrezia, now established in Ferrara as the wife of Alfonso d'Este, watched her family's collapse with a mixture of sorrow and pragmatic acceptance. Her marriage had insulated her from the immediate consequences of her father's death, but she understood that the Borgia name would be a liability for years to come. She began the delicate process of establishing her own identity, separate from her family's notorious reputation, using her intelligence and charm to build relationships within the Est court and broader Italian nobility. The transformation of Lucrezia from Borgia princess to Est duchess represented one of the few successful adaptations to the family's changed circumstances. She proved herself to be an incapable administrator and diplomat, managing her husband's territories during his frequent absences and maintaining correspondence with rulers throughout Europe. Her court in Ferrara became a center of Renaissance culture, attracting artists, writers, and intellectuals who helped rehabilitate her reputation and establish her as a patron of the arts in her own right. Caesar's final attempts to maintain his position became increasingly desperate and ultimately self-defeating. He allied himself with various condottieri and minor nobles, who promised to help him recover his territories. But these relationships were based on mutual desperation rather than genuine strength. His former reputation for invincibility had been shattered, and potential allies were more interested in exploiting his weakness than in genuinely supporting his cause. The capture of Cesare by Spanish forces in 1504 effectively ended his political career. He had been attempting to reach Naples, where he hoped to find support from his brother-in-law, the King of Navarre, but was intercepted and imprisoned. His captivity removed the last significant threat to Julius II's efforts to restore papal control over the former Borgia territories, allowing the new pope to complete the dismantling of Alexander's territorial empire. During his imprisonment, Cesare had ample time to reflect on the rapid rise and fall of his family's fortunes. He had come closer than perhaps any other individual to creating a unified Italian state under papal authority. But his success had ultimately depended heavily on his father's continued support and the acquiescence of enemies, who were merely waiting for their opportunity to strike back. His methods, while effective in the short term, had created too many enemies and too much resentment to be sustainable. The broader consequences of Alexander VI's papacy extended far beyond the immediate fate of his family. His blatant corruption and nepotism had provided ammunition for critics of the Church throughout Europe, contributing to the growing reform movements that would eventually culminate in the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther's famous 95 Theses, posted in 1517, directly addressed many of the abuses that had reached their peak during Alexander's reign, including the sale of indulgences and church offices. The Borgia legacy also influenced the development of Renaissance political thought, particularly through the writings of Niccolò Machiavelli. The Prince, written shortly after Cesare's fall from power, used Borgia methods as examples of both effective and ineffective political strategies. Machiavelli's analysis of power, morality, and statecraft was deeply informed by his observations of Alexander and Cesare, and his work would influence political thinking for centuries to come. In Spain, the Borgia name gradually recovered some of its luster through the achievements of family members who had remained distant from the Italian scandals. Saint Francis Borgia, great-grandson of Pope Alexander VI, became one of the most important figures in the Counter-Reformation and was eventually canonized by the Catholic Church. His sanctity provided a stark contrast to his ancestors' notoriety and demonstrated the complex legacy of a family that had produced both saints and sinners. The physical remnants of Borgia power in Italy were systematically destroyed or redistributed by Julius II and his successors. Cesare's carefully constructed administrative system was dismantled. His fortifications were razed or turned over to papal forces, and his territorial conquests were returned to their former rulers or incorporated directly into the papal states. Within a decade of Alexander's death, it was as if the Borgia Empire had never existed, except in the memories of those who had lived through its brief but spectacular rise and fall. The personal fate of the surviving Borgias reflected the broader collapse of their political ambitions. Cesare eventually escaped from Spanish captivity and made his way to Navarre, where he died in 1507 during a minor military campaign, killed in an obscure skirmish that bore no resemblance to the grand battles of his prime. He was 31 years old, and his death marked the final end of Borgia military power. Lucrezia's life in Ferrara, after her family's downfall, represented a remarkable transformation from the scandalous Borgia princess to one of the most respected duchesses in Italy. Her marriage to Alfonso d'Este had initially been viewed with suspicion by the Este family, who worried that the Borgia connection would bring unwanted attention and political complications. But Lucrezia's intelligence, diplomatic skills, and genuine commitment to her new role gradually won over even her harshest critics. The court of Ferrara, under Lucrezia's influence, became a haven for artists, poets, and scholars fleeing the political turmoil that continued to plague much of Italy. She patronized writers like Ludovico Ariosto, whose epic poem Orlando Furioso was dedicated to her family, and Pietro Bempo, with whom she maintained a lengthy and intellectually stimulating correspondence. Her salons attracted some of the finest minds of the Renaissance, and her reputation as a cultured and sophisticated patron helped rehabilitate the Borgia name in certain circles. But Lucrezia's success in Ferrara came at a personal cost that she rarely discussed publicly. She had been forced to abandon her young son Rodrigo, born from her marriage to Alfonso of Aragon, when she left Rome after her father's death. The boy remained in papal custody, and despite her efforts to maintain contact, she was effectively cut off from him. This separation haunted her for years, and contributed to her determination to be an exemplary mother to the children she bore. Alfonso d'Este, the broader Italian political landscape during the years following Alexander's death was characterized by constant warfare and shifting alliances as major European powers competed for dominance over the peninsula. France and Spain, in particular, viewed Italy as a crucial battleground in their larger struggle for European supremacy. The papacy, under Julius II and his successors, attempted to play these powers against each other while rebuilding the temporal authority that had been compromised by the Borgia scandals. Julius II's own military campaigns, conducted under the banner of restoring church lands, were every bit as brutal and politically motivated as those of Cesare Borgia. The difference was that Julius fought to expand traditional papal authority rather than to establish a personal dynasty. His siege of Bologna in 1506 and his participation in the League of Cambrai against Venice demonstrated that the papacy remained committed to temporal power, even if the methods and motivations had changed. The financial legacy of Alexander's reign continued to plague the church for decades. The vast sums that had been diverted to fund Cesare's campaigns and support the lavish Borgia lifestyle had depleted the papal treasury and forced subsequent popes to employ many of the same controversial fundraising methods that had scandalized Europe during Alexander's reign. The sale of indulgences, in particular, continued to expand as popes sought to finance their own military and political ambitions. In Germany, the growing criticism of papal corruption found its most eloquent voice in Martin Luther, whose personal experiences with church abuses had been shaped by the excesses of the Borgia era. Luther's attack on indulgences in 1517 was directly connected to the fundraising methods that had been perfected during Alexander's papacy. When Luther declared that the Pope had no authority to release souls from purgatory in exchange for money, he was challenging a practice that had reached its most extreme form under Borgia rule. The Protestant Reformation that followed Luther's initial protests represented, in many ways, a delayed reaction to the scandals of Alexander's reign. The moral authority of the papacy had been so severely compromised by Borgia behavior that millions of Christians were prepared to reject papal authority entirely, rather than continue accepting the corruption that seemed endemic to the Roman Church. The religious wars that devastated Europe for the next century could trace their origins, at least in part, to the crisis of legitimacy created by Alexander VI. Within the Catholic Church itself, the Council of Trent, which met intermittently from 1545 to 1563, was largely devoted to addressing the abuses that had reached their peak during the Borgia papacy. The council's decrees on clerical celibacy, the sale of church offices, and the proper administration of sacraments were direct responses to the scandals that had characterized Alexander's reign. The Counter-Reformation that emerged from Trent represented a systematic attempt to restore the Church's moral credibility and spiritual authority. The historical reputation of Alexander VI and his family became a subject of intense debate among scholars and chroniclers. Contemporary accounts were heavily influenced by political bias, with supporters emphasizing their administrative competence and cultural patronage, while critics focused on their moral failings and political corruption. Later historians struggled to separate fact from propaganda, particularly regarding the more sensational accusations of incest, murder, and devil worship that surrounded the Borgia name. Modern scholarship has generally concluded that while Alexander and his children were undoubtedly guilty of serious moral and political transgressions, many of the most extreme accusations against them were exaggerated or fabricated by their enemies. The charge of incest between Alexander and Lucrezia, for example, appears to have been based more on political propaganda than credible evidence. Similarly, while Cesare was certainly responsible for numerous murders, the accusations that he poisoned rivals at dinner parties were likely embellished for dramatic effect. What remains undeniable is that Alexander VI represented a fundamental corruption of papal authority that had profound consequences for the Catholic Church and European Christianity more broadly. His open acknowledgement of his children, his blatant sale of church offices, and his use of spiritual authority for temporal gain created a crisis of legitimacy that took generations to resolve. The Protestant Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, and the religious wars that followed were all, in various ways, responses to the crisis that Alexander's reign had created. The physical legacy of the Borgias in Rome was systematically erased by subsequent popes who sought to distance the church from their memory. The Borgia apartments in the Vatican were sealed and abandoned for centuries, their frescoes hidden from view as if the very sight of Borgia symbols might contaminate the papal residence. It was not until the late 19th century that these rooms were reopened and restored, by which time they were viewed more as historical curiosities than as reminders of papal scandal. The Borgia coat of arms, featuring the famous bull that had symbolized their power, was removed from buildings throughout Rome and the Papal States. Churches and palaces that had been built or renovated during Alexander's reign were rededicated, their Borgia associations carefully obscured or eliminated. The systematic erasure of Borgia symbols represented a deliberate attempt to rewrite history and restore the dignity of papal authority. Yet, despite these efforts to erase their memory, the Borgias continued to fascinate subsequent generations. Their story embodied the contradictions and excesses of Renaissance Italy. Combining political brilliance with moral corruption, cultural sophistication with brutal violence, and genuine family affection with ruthless ambition, they became symbols of an age when the boundaries between sacred and secular authority had become dangerously blurred, and when personal ambition could corrupt even the highest spiritual offices. The final chapter of the Borgia story played out in Spain, where family members who had remained distant from the Italian scandals worked to rehabilitate their name through piety and service to the Church. The canonization of Saint Francis Borgia in 1671 represented a remarkable transformation of the family's reputation, demonstrating that even the most notorious bloodlines could produce saints as well as sinners. The canonization of Saint Francis Borgia marked a profound irony in the family's history. While his great-grandfather, Alexander VI, had scandalized Christendom with his worldly pursuits and moral transgressions, Francis embraced a life of extreme asceticism and spiritual devotion. that would eventually earn him recognition as one of the Catholic Church's most important reformers. His transformation from Spanish duke to Jesuit priest represented everything that Alexander's critics had demanded from church leadership: genuine piety, personal sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to spiritual rather than temporal goals. Francis Borgia's decision to abandon his wealth and noble status to join the Society of Jesus sent shockwaves through Spanish society. As Duke of Gandia, he had been one of the most powerful nobles in Spain, with vast estates and significant political influence. His renunciation of these privileges to become a simple priest was seen as a direct repudiation of the worldly ambitions that had characterized his ancestors' papacy. His subsequent work as a Jesuit missionary and administrator helped establish the order as one of the most effective instruments of the Counter-Reformation. The contrast between the two Borgias could not have been more stark. Where Alexander had used his position to advance his family's temporal interests, Francis used his noble background to advance the Church's spiritual mission. Where Alexander had accumulated wealth and power for his children, Francis embraced poverty and obedience as fundamental virtues. Where Alexander had scandalized Europe with his personal conduct, Francis became renowned for his holiness and moral integrity. Yet even Francis could not entirely escape the shadow of his family's reputation. Throughout his life, he faced whispered accusations and subtle discrimination from those who remembered the scandals of Alexander's reign. His elevation within the Jesuit order was sometimes questioned by those who wondered whether Borgia blood might carry some hereditary taint. His canonization process, which took over a century to complete, was delayed partly by concerns about rehabilitating a family name that had become synonymous with papal corruption. The broader European context during the decades following Alexander's death was shaped by the religious and political upheavals that his reign had helped precipitate. The Protestant Reformation had fractured Christian unity, creating new churches and new forms of religious authority that challenged the papal monopoly on spiritual leadership. The Catholic Church's response, known as the Counter-Reformation, was essentially an attempt to address the very problems that had reached their peak during the Borgia papacy. The Council of Trent's reforms directly targeted many of the abuses that had characterized Alexander's reign. The requirement that bishops reside in their dioceses was a response to the widespread practice of treating church offices as sources of revenue rather than pastoral responsibilities. The prohibition on selling ecclesiastical positions addressed the simony that had reached unprecedented levels under Alexander. The emphasis on clerical education and moral formation was designed to prevent the kind of scandalous behavior that had made the Borgias notorious throughout Europe. But the damage to papal authority proved difficult to repair. The Protestant churches that emerged from the Reformation rejected papal supremacy entirely, arguing that the corruption exemplified by Alexander VI proved that the Bishop of Rome had no special claim to spiritual authority, even within Catholic territories. The papacy's temporal power was increasingly challenged by secular rulers who had witnessed how spiritual authority could be corrupted by worldly ambitions. The political fragmentation of Italy continued for centuries, partly as a consequence of the power vacuum created by the collapse of Borgia territorial ambitions. Cesare's brief success in unifying central Italy under papal authority had demonstrated the possibility of Italian political unity. But his methods had been so brutal and his legitimacy so questionable that his empire collapsed immediately upon his father's death. Subsequent attempts at Italian unification would not succeed until the 19th century. And even then, the process was complicated by the papacy's resistance to losing its temporal authority. The artistic and cultural legacy of the Borgia era proved more enduring than their political achievements. The patronage of artists and scholars that had characterized Alexander's court, despite its moral controversies, had contributed to the flowering of Renaissance culture. The Borgia apartments in the Vatican, decorated by Pinturicchio with frescoes celebrating the family's achievements, remained as testimony to their cultural sophistication even after their political power had been destroyed. Lucrezia's court in Ferrara became one of the most important cultural centers of the late Renaissance, attracting artists and writers who might otherwise have been associated with more traditional noble families. Her correspondence with leading intellectuals of her time reveals a woman of considerable learning and refinement, far removed from the scandalous reputation that had followed her from Rome. Her patronage of literature and music helped establish new forms of artistic expression that would influence European culture for generations. The historical assessment of the Borgias continued to evolve as new documents were discovered and as scholars developed more sophisticated methods of analyzing Renaissance sources. The 19th century Romantic movement, with its fascination for dramatic and transgressive figures, contributed to a revival of interest in Borgia history. Writers like Victor Hugo and Alexandre Dumas found in the Borgias perfect subjects for exploring themes of power, corruption, and family loyalty that resonated with contemporary audiences. The 20th century brought more systematic historical research that attempted to separate fact from legend in Borgia history. Scholars like Ferdinand Gregorovius and Ludwig Pastor examined Vatican archives and contemporary chronicles to construct more accurate accounts of Alexander's reign and Caesar's campaigns. Their work revealed that while the Borgias were certainly guilty of serious abuses, many of the most sensational stories about them had been exaggerated or invented by their enemies. Modern historians generally agreed that Alexander VI was neither the monster depicted by his harshest critics nor the capable administrator praised by his supporters, but rather a complex figure whose genuine political talents were fatally compromised by his moral failings and dynastic ambitions. His love for his children, which was perhaps his most human characteristic, ultimately became the source of his greatest scandals, as he used papal authority to advance their worldly interests. Cesare Borgia's historical reputation has undergone perhaps the most dramatic rehabilitation. Once dismissed as a brutal tyrant, he is now often recognized as a brilliant military strategist and political innovator whose methods, while harsh, were not significantly different from those employed by other successful Renaissance rulers. Machiavelli's analysis of Cesare and the Prince has contributed to this reassessment, as scholars have come to appreciate the sophistication of his political thinking even while condemning his moral choices. Lucrezia's reputation has also been largely rehabilitated by modern scholarship. The accusations of incest and murder that surrounded her name appear to have been based more on political propaganda than credible evidence. Her life in Ferrara demonstrated her capacity for personal growth and positive contribution to Renaissance culture, suggesting that she was more victim than perpetrator of her family's scandals. The ultimate legacy of the Borgia papacy lies not in the specific achievements or failures of Alexander and his children, but in the broader questions their story raises about the relationship between spiritual authority and temporal power. Their reign demonstrated the dangers inherent in combining religious leadership with political ambition, and their downfall illustrated the impossibility of maintaining spiritual credibility while pursuing worldly goals through corrupt means. The Protestant Reformation, which followed within a generation of Alexander's death, represented the most serious challenge to papal authority in church history. While the Reformation had multiple causes, the crisis of legitimacy created by Borgia scandals was certainly a contributing factor. The reformers' arguments that the papacy had been corrupted beyond redemption gained credibility from the recent memory of Alexander's reign and the obvious need for fundamental changes in church governance.